So recording has started. So yeah, I'd like to thank the EDI committee and the NHLA full board who really gave me some very good and helpful critical assessment when I would bring them ideas for speakers. This is an incredibly conscientious and compassionate and passionate group of colleagues we have here. They were really concerned about creating a white echo chamber and just trying to figure out how can we figure out and learn what the next step is. Because, you know, to be honest, we don't know. And even if some of us might know, we all want to be on the same page. We want to work together as an organization and as colleagues so that we can bring good into our workplaces, I think into our own professional and personal development and into our communities, of course. So thank you to EDI committee and the NHLA board. I want to also call out thanks to Lisa Joes, Linda Pilla, Marina Buckler, and Sarah St. Martin, just for handling the registration stuff and the website stuff. They were fantastic, and I threw a lot of stuff at them very quickly because of how things move so quickly with moving this to an online conference and business meeting. So what we're going to be hearing today from Shay is a conversation entitled Authentic Dialogues, talking about racism and moving to action. This will be a lecture and small group work. 72 participants that we have will be broken out randomly into breakout rooms. Just a reminder for when we get there. If you're someone who tends to talk a lot, like possibly myself, try and let others speak up. You know, practice some self-control there and let other people speak up. If you're someone who's a little more quiet, please be encouraged to speak up. We want to figure out what is the work we're doing. And it's going to be difficult conversations, but let's lean into that. I know these are kind of some buzzwords, but I'm going to use them anyway. So let's just, you know, respect each other when we get to our conversations, assume best intentions from everyone, and let's figure out how we move forward together. I'd also like to thank the Urban Library Administrators Cooperative for sponsoring $1,000 of this talk, and also to the Maryhill Rock Cooperative, who sponsored $100 worth of registrations for today. So, Shay Stewart-Bouley was born and raised on a combination of big city attitude and Midwestern sensibility as a Chicago native, also known as Black girl in Maine. Had to learn a bit of Yankee ingenuity when she relocated to Maine in 2002. After a brief foray into education, Shay bridged her socially minded work from Chicago, working with the homeless, to Maine by working with low-income and at-risk youth in Southern Maine, and she is currently the executive director of Community Change, Inc., a 50-year-old anti-racism organization based in Boston that organizes and educates for racial equity with a specific focus on working with white people. What the fuck? Shay has been blogging since 2008, frequently on matters of social justice and systemic racism through her Black Girl in Maine website. And in 2011, she won a New England Press Association Award for her writing on race and diversity for the Portland Phoenix. Shay's writing also has been featured in a variety of Maine and national publications, as well as several anthologies. In November 2016, Shay gave a TEDx Talk entitled Inequality, Injustice, Infection. Shay is a graduate of both DePaul University and Antioch University, New England. And even though she works in Boston now, she is indeed still a Black girl in Maine, continuing to reside in Maine. Let's please welcome Shay Stewart-Bouley.
Great. Well, thank you for having me this morning. It's funny because I feel like this is probably my 5th or 6th presentation via Zoom, and I still find them to be really strange. It's just a really weird way to connect, especially because anti-racism work is deeply personal. Can you all hear me? Okay, cool. Excellent. You know, a big part of anti-racism work is about being in relationship with other people. And the reality of COVID is that it makes it extremely hard to be in relationships with people. When I devised this talk a number of years ago, it was an offshoot of the work that I do with author Debbie Irving. We do a similar version of this with two people. And I decided, you know, I could do a one-person version of this. When Yvette contacted me, I made it really clear I'm not going to be giving you some training today. It's really a conversation. The nature of the work that I do at CCI has allowed me to believe that, especially in this moment where a lot of white people are really wanting to dive into this work, the problem is you can't really dive into this work until you've kind of done some internal work around like your own interpersonal self and how you think about race as a white person. So my remarks today are really geared towards getting people to sort of think about it outside of the diversity, equity, and inclusion lens, which I will be honest and say that the work that we do at CCI is not diversity, equity, or inclusion. Big part, in fact, I am not a fan of any of those terms because I feel like too often the key goal is how to assimilate BIPOC people into white spaces and not how to dismantle white supremacy and a messed up system. So, on that note, Yvette already kind of told you what today will be is I'm going to talk for about 20, 30 minutes. It used to be a 30-minute talk, but I've learned also in Zoom land that without the natural flow of an audience to read your face and pause, it sometimes goes a little bit quicker than that. It's one of the hardest things when you speak to, you know, to an audience. It's like, oh, I can't read your faces right now, your boxes. So it may go a little bit quicker than that. But that's probably good because what that means is it will allow us to have a little bit more time in the group work that folks will be doing. Typically, you would have 25 to 30 minutes in the group. And given that I believe these groups are going to be broken into groups of 10, I want to make sure everybody's voice is heard. And then we come back together, sort of debrief what came up in those groups. And then it's an open Q&A. And then I'll have a couple of, you know, book resources that I'm going to suggest, you know, assuming people haven't already read them. So I'm going to kick that off. And by the way, I do stop to take a water break because the other thing I've learned with Zoom is that when you're doing all the talking and there's no natural pause, you get really thirsty. So just put out all of that because one of the other things around my work, it's to be really human. And to be really human at times is to also be raggedy and admit, like, I get thirsty. So on that note, I always like to tell people now that I'm working on Zoom, I do use notes because in this moment, for me, I find that ensuring that my words are heard is actually more important than the look of perfectionism. The quest actually for perfectionism, which runs really high in our culture, is often rooted in systems of whiteness, and it's harmful. The talk that we're about to have is about having authentic conversations on race, and yet, in order to have authentic conversations on race, we have to have a shared language and understanding of history in the United States. As we bear witness to the current racial tensions in this country, it's becoming really clear to me that many of those of us who claim to be anti-racist have erred in our thinking. We made assumptions, and the truth is, despite the anti-racism books that are all the rage and all the conversations that we've actually been having now for a number of years, we really haven't moved the needle on race in this country. In order to discuss race, and more importantly, to hold authentic conversations requires courage for white-bodied people. Discussions on race are not a voyeuristic effort. This moment, despite the media portrayal, is not about being heartbroken for Black people or people of color. It's also about being heartbroken for white people as well. Because as awful as things have been for Black folks and other people of color in this country, they've actually been worse for white folks. Because for white-bodied people, many of you have been living with half-truths about your reality. And living a half-truth or half a lie is never really a good thing. So as we begin this morning, I want to just share some quick agreements for this session. And I'm going to ask that you honor the agreements of our time together and in this space. I'm going to ask you to locate yourself, just kind of where you are in your body in this moment as we start this conversation. I'm going to ask you to listen to understand. I'm going to ask you to be willing to experience discomfort. Expect and accept non-closure. We're discussing a foundational problem with our country. And this morning, we're not going to solve anything. But what this conversation will hopefully do is move you closer to your truth and how that truth will play out in your community and in your work. I ask for confidentiality. While I understand the first portion of this is being recorded, I would obviously ask that the second parts, part 2 and part 3 are not recorded, especially because people will be, opening themselves up. And lastly, I ask for brave space, not safe space. Talking about race, especially for white-bodied people, is rarely safe. So I'm going to ask you to be brave. And hopefully you can sit with those truths. Now we're going to create some shared language for this morning. White supremacy is the deep-rooted and long-standing exploitation, control, and violence directed at Black, Indigenous, and people of color, with a deeper disdain for Black folks in particular, which is often referred to as anti-Blackness. The benefits of white supremacy accrue primarily to white-bodied people, particularly to male, white, Christian, cisgender, ruling, or owning class people. Racism is often distilled down to prejudice, ignorance, or negative thoughts about people of color, but that's actually not accurate. Those are the side effects of a white supremacist system. In order to talk authentically about racism, we have to understand that racism operates on 4 different levels. There's interpersonal racism. Most of the racism that is commonly discussed happens at the interpersonal level. This includes personal acts of harassment, exclusion, marginalization, discrimination, hate, or violence towards an individual or group based on their racial identity. Hate crimes, racial profiling, job or housing discrimination can be examples of interpersonal racism. Next, we have institutional racism. That is the racism which is built into our institutions via the policies, procedures, and everyday practices of systems such as our healthcare, education systems, job markets, housing markets, the media, the criminal and legal system, just to name a few systems. Without the intention to be explicitly anti-racist and to challenge those systems and to just follow the rules of those institutions, often will produce outcomes that benefit white people and create harm for people of color because the rules themselves are designed to reproduce racism. We also have structural racism. This is the marriage of interpersonal and institutional racism, and it creates a system of structural racism, meaning the racism of different institutions overlaps, reinforces, and amplifies the disparate treatment of BIPOC folks. An example of this would be the school to prison pipeline. Racism within our schools, as well as our criminal and legal system, produces a society which disproportionately limits the educational opportunities of young people of color and also disproportionately disciplines them and locks them up. A perfect example of this, it's a story that came out now, probably around April, May, sometime when we were still pretty early in the pandemic. And there was a story that went national about a young Black woman in Michigan. She was a teenager who had been sent to a juvenile facility for skipping classes despite having an IEP and documented learning disabilities. Yes, she had skipped school, but there were some mitigating circumstances. Lastly, we have what's referred to as cultural racism. Cultural racism is reinforced through systemic and pervasive images, pictures, comments, literature, advertisements, and online media portrayals of BIPOC folks as inferior, lazy, sexually manipulative, infantile, and less smart than white people. Another word that I want to define, which I tend to use often, is whiteness. White supremacy and racism is based on whiteness, which is an evolving boundary separating those who are entitled to certain benefits from those whose exploitation and vulnerability is subject to not being white. Whiteness as a system creates the rules and determines the societal norms in which we all live in. So now that we have a shared frame, I want to talk about something that I know has been really kind of, hot. I hate to say hot, but it's probably the best word to use in recent months, given the racial tensions in this country. Why Black Lives Matter. Those three words have become really interesting in that they were created as an affirmation of Black life and Black humanity, and 7 years later, they've become really divisive in some areas. And so I always, when I do a talk like this, at this point, I actually want to bring up why Black Lives Matter and why it matters that you can say those words and take action to show that you are in support of Black lives. The racial moment that we are currently experiencing as a nation, while it's most certainly disturbing and jarring, especially against the backdrop of this pandemic we find ourselves in, this moment itself is not new. It is simply another reminder of how, as a nation, we have successfully avoided the affirmation of Black humanity. It has been approximately over 400 years since enslaved Africans were brought to this country, forced to build a nation that would eventually become a superpower. For hundreds of years, the free labor that was given by those enslaved Africans helped to create America's powerful head start economically, which is not unlike the way that white-bodied people right now, despite their socio-economic standing, have a head start. And even after slavery ended, Black people were relegated to a second-class status of terror, which was reinforced through various laws that did not legally end until 1968. In fact, it was in the summer of 1967 that there were racial riots that were occurring, and the federal government wanted to know what to do at that time. For those of you who may have been around at that time or are familiar with that, summer of 1967 was a really racially tense summer, very similar to what we've just experienced this year in this country. At the time, President Lyndon Johnson ended up appointing a commission that would come to be known as the Kerner Commission to figure out what to do to what they referred to at that time as the, quote, Negro problem. The commission's findings were pretty astounding in early 1968. The report was best summed up this way. In 1968, which when you think about it in the context of where we are in 2020, it's really pretty jarring. Our nation is moving towards two societies, one Black, one white, separate and unequal. In short, the Kerner Commission report found that the racial riots of 1967 were a direct result of unfair and unequal treatment by white-bodied people. Like today, white people were living primarily in racially siloed lives, and Black folks did not have equal access to the same things that white folks had at that time, such as housing, jobs, things of that nature. The Commission report recommendations were pretty amazing given the time frame that we're talking about, and that there was a direct call to reallocate federal resources to make changes in Black communities, as well as several other actions that never saw the light of day. 2 years ago was the 50th anniversary of the Kerner Commission report, and a lot of those in the anti-racism field went back to go look at that report to see what has changed and what remains the same. And what they actually found in 2018 was that many of the same issues that came to light in 1967 and 1968 are still plaguing this country. In fact, one could say that concerns over civil rights, racial division, and racial disparities are in many ways now more pressing than they've ever been in this country. Because the sad reality is that, aside from a few notable exceptions, life has not gotten better for Black folks in this country. And with an administration that has been happy to stoke the racial flames, things have actually rapidly gotten worse. The reason that this brief history lesson is important is that in order to figure out what to do and to understand how you might actually even have conversations in your communities, in your homes, you really have to have a sense of where we've been as a country. You cannot hold an authentic conversation on race without discussing and owning our authentically painful racial history in this country, which is actually one of the challenges of the first wave of diversity work that really started in earnest in the 1990s, where again, there was a focus on assimilation into white culture without any acknowledgement of the hundreds of years of harm that have been done. And for many of you, there may be a question that I imagine many of you have been asking yourselves, that living in 2020, as we live in this increasingly racially polarized country, How did we get here, and what is our responsibility in this moment? It's a really powerful question to think about as we continue here. So since 1968 and that report, overall conditions we know have not improved, in part because we're living with the same oppressive structures that were in place in 1968. And the uncomfortable and painful truth is that Black lives, from a structural and institutional perspective, really don't still matter. Because if they did, we would have done a lot more structural work instead of the surface work that we've done. And while most of our conversations in this current moment have started due to the painful and horrific extrajudicial shootings and killings of often unarmed Black people, which thanks to the advent of technology and social media, we're now all able to witness that. The reality is there's no section of Black life in this country that is not framed through a white supremacist lens and impacts Black bodies from birth to death. What I often like to do when I talk with groups is to give you some context of thinking about, when we talk about the disparities, what do those things actually look like? And I think especially when we're, given that we're all in northern New England specifically, it's really important to just be mindful of what do those stats look like. Some of those examples would be that Black women have higher rates of pregnancy-related mortality. Pregnancy-related mortality for a Black woman with a college degree is 5.2% higher than her white counterpart. We know that overall health outcomes for Black folks, even with college degrees and high incomes, is still worse than their white peers. A few years ago, there was a study that came out where medical students admitted that they thought that Black people had higher pain thresholds, and they were not as inclined to treat Black pain. So when you think about that in the context of race, how much needless suffering happens due to racial bias that shows up everywhere? We know that the rates of incarceration are most certainly higher for Black folks due to racial bias. An example that I like to give right now, given the state of the world, is for those of you old enough to remember, you may have remembered the drug wars of the 1980s, where Blacks and Latinos were incarcerated at higher rates, often due to the sentencing discrepancy in powdered cocaine versus crack cocaine. What that came down to was that white folks who were often caught with powdered cocaine, which was more expensive, often received a slap on the wrist versus the longer sentences that Blacks and Latinos received, which ultimately led to the decimation of many Black and Latino communities in this country. But the thing is that when you balance what happened in the 1980s, when you look at the past 5 years in this country and the current opioid crisis, and you look at who's been disproportionately affected there, white folks. And suddenly, what in the 1980s, when it was Black and brown bodies, was a criminal issue, has now become a public health issue, which it should have been in the 1980s. White addicts have received compassion in recent years during the opioid crisis that has historically been denied to their Black and brown counterparts. In fact, the ongoing opioid crisis demonstrates how the system chooses who to humanize and who not to humanize, and how that plays out on a structural level. Because the reality is that racism is woven into all of our structures, whether it is a child skipping school or a drug addict who needs treatment. In this country, your destiny is largely determined by your zip code, which is often determined by your race. And in America, if you are white, there's more of a tendency that you will find grace that versus if you are Black or brown, you will not find that. Which means, as a white person, while it is critical to understand how racism operates on an interpersonal, institutional, structural, and cultural level, it's also important to understand how racism has shaped your sense of self and your sense of whiteness. How whiteness is the guiding lens that guides your sense of right and wrong, and it privileges you regardless of your socioeconomic level. White culture is the majority dominant culture, and yet it is predicated on the dehumanization of non-white bodies. And until you can sit with that, many of the talks of racism will never move beyond the superficial level, much less will people be moved to actively work to dismantle this system. So if you're ready for that deeper dive, the work is more than reading anti-racism books, putting a sign in the yard, or hearing speakers such as myself. It's literally about shifting your worldview and becoming more expansive. It's about not making excuses or justifications for racism. There have been some polls that have come out recently, including one from the Boston Globe in the past month, which has shown that white support for the Black Lives Matter movement is dropping amongst white folks. It was at an all-time high in late May, early June. And one of the reasons that has been quoted for this drop has been, many have cited the violence that we saw in some of the cities this year as a key reason. And yet, I counter, and I've countered for months, to anyone who says that. If you are the descendants of people who have never been treated equitably and who've always had to fight for their humanity after 400 years, would you not be mad? Which poses the question, why is Black anger so hard to digest? I think in this moment where there is a real enthusiasm, and I think in many cases it's a really sincere enthusiasm to work, to do anti-racism work, too often it comes with caveats that Black and brown people are not entitled to be angry. They must conform to a way of life that makes white people comfortable and centers white folks. And yet that's not how we're actually going to move the needle on race, which again poses the question, why is Black anger so hard for white-bodied people to digest? I always give this example because I think it's really important given this current moment that we're in politically. Former President Barack Obama and his family were damn near perfect in terms of a presidential family. They were aesthetically pleasing to whiteness, and yet we know that they dealt with a steady stream of racism and threats that none of their counterparts had ever received. We also can't forget that the current president played a role in stoking the racial fires of racism during Obama's 2 terms. In this moment, as you're asked to affirm that Black Lives Matter and that you think about thinking about doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work, you have to understand that these are just not phrases, but a true request for the validation that has so long been denied to people. And at this point, you may be wondering, but when are we going to learn how to be allies? How can we help? Well, as I tell people, when you can say everything that I just said and understand why you're saying it and say it with conviction, backed up with material support and resources, that is the beginning of becoming an ally. Understanding without shame and guilt that as a white-bodied person, you are the beneficiary of a system that you did not create, but that you can actively work to change, starting in your own communities. Thinking about questions such as, how are the people of color in your community treated? Who is arrested in your community? Do your lived and stated values reflect a deep commitment to the fact that Black lives matter and to anti-racism work? Do you understand that in a country that has never valued Black life, that saying all lives matter is a cowardly deflection at best? To be an ally is to educate, mobilize, and organize other white people. You don't need me or any other Black, Indigenous person of color to tell you how to do the right thing. Being an ally means that you respect BIPOC folks. You actually listen to us. You find out about us. You stand by our side. You are honest. You take risks. You talk to other white people. You interrupt jokes and comments about racism. And you also know that in this journey, you will make mistakes. It also means that given your work as library professionals, in this moment, you have to be willing to create the space for the deeper conversations without the equivocation that is popular in this moment. This morning, as I was thinking about what it would mean to talk to a group of library professionals in a predominantly white state, knowing that most of the folks who would be on this call this morning were white, I had a lot of thoughts about that. I'm your neighbor next door in Maine. I live on a little island off the coast here. And one of the things that I've learned in my years here in New England is that there's a real tendency to shy away from uncomfortable conversations. In fact, all my years here now, 18, I've had a joke for years. I'm like, people here talk an awful lot about the weather or that football team, the one in Massachusetts. You know the one. I grew up in Bears land, Patriots. That's who they are. And it's really hard to get people to have honest conversations. And I think a big part of that is the culture here. And I know most certainly where I live here in Maine, and I imagine I've got some colleagues, you know, in New Hampshire, that just even sticking up a Black Lives Matter sign, you know, can lead to, you know, vandalism or just, you know, heated words or whatever. You know, commonly people will say the throwback is, well, all lives matter. But then I thought about something, so I should just probably disclose this. I'm not a pet person, so I have allergies. I've just never been a pet person. I got chased by a German Shepherd when I was 8, pretty much cemented my dislike of dogs for life. I had a cat, and now I'm like deathly allergic to cats, so not a pet person. But I realize that most people are pet people, and I thought about this. We're living in a moment that if we were discussing animal cruelty, there would be no other sideism. There would be no other side or equivocation. As a society, in this country, I'm going to say the U.S., we have generally decided that we don't eat dogs, we don't beat dogs, we don't brutalize them. It's not acceptable. There is no other side to that. In fact, to make it really clear, as I was thinking about this, I was remembering that ball player Mike Vick, who got convicted for the dog fighting years ago. In fact, when people are cruel to animals, we lock them up. And yet, we tolerate racism. We try to explain it away or shut it down with, well, all lives matter. So I posed the question that I was thinking about this morning. What does that say about white-bodied people? The inability to look critically at this country's racial history, even in this moment, as people are fighting for their humanity. What does that say? We as a nation, we will debate the merits of whether a marginalized group is still fully human and entitled to the benefits and reality that accrue to white-bodied people. And too often, we worry about getting political and rocking the boat. And yet, human rights and decency in America are political. This is a country that wrote a constitution, and when they first wrote it, Black people weren't even fully human. So human rights and decency in America is political, always has been. And the reality is that if you are invested and you're interested in, from what I, just in the process I went through talking to a vet, this is the work that your group wants to do, and you want to bring this work into your communities, you have to understand that the only way that we're going to have an equitable world is to rock the boat. There's no other way around that. So at this point, I've finished my remarks, and I want to give some space for you all to break out into your groups. I have some questions, and maybe I should put them in the chat. First, I want people to think about just how did these words land with you? How are you feeling in this moment? The next question is, what I want you to think about, how has racism distorted your worldview? Yeah, I kind of want it to be an open-ended question. So how has racism distorted your worldview? I also want you to think about one concrete action that you can take in your professional space to become actively anti-racist. I'm going to put these questions into the chat, and hopefully they will land with people before you are broken into a group. And this is the part of doing this on Zoom, which is really weird because there's no response and I feel like I'm talking to myself. Okay, so I just put them in the chat. How did the talk make you feel? How has racism distorted your worldview? And what is one concrete action you can take in your space to be anti-racist? Given the size, Yvette, if I'm correct, you told me you're going to break them into groups of 10?
Actually, I have been playing with the numbers, and I'm
Okay.
probably going to have 5 or 6 in a room.
Okay. Yeah, that would actually, I think 5 or 6 would be better than 10. I feel like 10 is too much. So I want to give everyone about 20 minutes that would come back in 20 minutes after you've been broken into your groups. And then I want to have a sharing and then a general Q&A.
Okay. Here we go, guys. I'm stopping the recording.